Hey guys, bringing you another art tutorial. We're continuing in the same workspace that we had before, and this time I wanted to talk about how to draw ellipses in perspective. And typically you would do an ellipse with an ellipse guide, and that's a perfectly normal way to do it. Let me open up a new layer here so that we can do everything on a clean slate, and we'll hide those layers so that they don't interfere. Sketchbook actually has an ellipse guide. If we use this handle here and you look at the bottom of the screen, you can see that there's an ellipse angle being noted at the bottom. So if I want to set up a 35-degree angle, I could do that by setting the angle to 35 degrees, and if I draw with a brush that actually shows up as a line, we can draw a 35-degree ellipse pretty easily like that. However, I do have one gripe about this technique, and that is the fact that if we take our ruler tool and we line it up from point to point, we can see that the distance between top to middle and middle to bottom is exactly the same. And depending on the type of drawing you're doing, that might not be a bad thing, but it's not really very realistic to what you would see in real life. So what I wanted to show you today is a simple technique to draw things that is a little more visually attractive when it comes to ellipses. And for this I'm going to move my perspective dot way over to the side so that I have some more room to work with. And we're going to set up some construction lines to get started. So we need a top and a bottom. And we're going to start with actually a square, which might not be the most intuitive shape to think of when you want to draw something circular, but it'll all make sense in a bit. And I'm going to just estimate what a good width for this shape should be, and I'm going to put it there. And just like in the previous video, we're going to do a little bit of subdividing with our newly formed plane. So we're going to split it into, actually we're going to split it into 4 smaller versions of itself. But we're going to start by splitting it into 4 triangles. We can then use perspective mode to draw a line going through the center vertically and through the center laterally, if I can get that line to show up. There we go. So we now have 4 smaller squares here, 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 and here, and we're going to complete the X's that we did from the first square into these now smaller squares. So we just do that like so. And like I mentioned in previous videos, Autodesk Sketchbook is now free, so I highly recommend that you download it. Makes doing stuff like this a lot faster. Alright, so now we've got 4 subdivided squares. And we're going to do a bit more subdividing here, and we're just going to draw some small dash lines halfway between this point and the opposing corner point of the larger original square. And that's all the construction that we need to get our ellipse started. And I'm going to do this on another layer, so we can still see our construction lines from below, but now we can draw on this layer without worrying about how it's going to look, about messing up any construction lines or having those interfere with the work later. And from this point, it's really simple. You just connect the dots. And if you have a very astute artistic eye, you may have already noticed that there is one major side effect to using this technique, and that is if we hide the construction lines, parts of this ellipse have now gotten very flat. Specifically, this part here and this part here. Now, if you're looking at a circular object at an ellipse angle in real life, you'll notice that the farther edge is actually flatter. That's because it's further away from you. You can't discern as much of the curvature as you can with the front. We do want to fix a little bit of the flatness of the front edge though. So all that is just a little bit of refinement. As you cross these dashed lines, I find it helpful to use them as kind of like a ramp. Like, you don't want to come here flat early. You want to always kind of point back a little bit towards that dash line. And if I grab my eraser tool, we can see that that refinement has already made it a little bit better. Essentially, you just want to remember that you're drawing a circular object. It's not going to have very much of a flat spot here. So you want to come in, even if it's just a very shallow angle, it makes a big difference. So I'll grab my ballpoint again, and we'll just do a little bit more of that refinement. And when I get to the top and bottom dash, I find it's useful to make sure that I'm definitely following the perspective guideline that we drew earlier, just a little bit past it, so that we can get more of a curve pushed into these corners. That just helps it look a little more realistic when we erase some of our guidelines. Alright, now if we hide our construction lines, we can see that we have a pretty decent looking ellipse. Now, it's not the greatest. Obviously, if you were doing this as a professional piece, you would spend more time in the refinement process. From the beginning, I probably could have made my square a little wider, and that would give it more of a curve here. It's really just comes down to experience. As you go, you'll start to figure out where you need to put your lines. But I wanted to make this video to show you guys the basic construction that you can do to set up an ellipse. To drive the point home, let's grab that ellipse tool again, and let's try to set up a similar thing with the ellipse guide. And you'll kind of see what I'm talking about when I say that it's not as visually realistic as what we did here. So I'm guessing that we did somewhat of like a 25-degree ellipse. So we'll just trace that in, and you can see that our ellipse is definitely different than what the ellipse guide will give you. Just because it hasn't been refined as much over here, you might like this one more, but theoretically this one is more accurate to how your eye would perceive things in the real world. If we take a cross section of this ellipse, you can see that, let's see, I need to actually put it in the middle. You can see that the front portion is wider than the back portion, just by a little bit, but it makes a big difference when you're looking at it. Whereas, as mentioned before, these ones are exactly the same size. You can also combine this with the technique mentioned in a previous video with regular intervals. If we bring up our construction lines again, and let's erase that other ellipse. You can see that since we still use the same basis for a construction line, namely a top and bottom line, you could just keep this technique going very simply by getting out your ruler tool, lining it up with the top corner of your original square and the midpoint of your of the same square, and then just drawing a dashed line through the bottom. Then if we pull out perspective mode again, we can draw a second square. And you could just keep this technique repeating until you get to the horizon point. Realistically, I wouldn't expect anyone to use this technique every single time they want to draw a circle. In some cases, it's definitely okay, and it'll look just fine if you just use your intuition and draw it the way that you think it should go. But if you're just starting out and you're trying to get a good grasp on everything, this is a good way to set up your construction lines from the beginning so that you can get something a little more accurate as you're practicing those techniques. I hope you guys found this technique useful, and let me know down in the comments if there's something you think I should cover in a future video. And I'd love to see links to anything you use this technique for in your own art, so let me know down in the comments. Anyways, that's all I have for you guys today. Have a good one.